Hi, my name is Eleanor, and I'm 56 years old. Life has a way of surprising you, taking you down paths you never expected. 2 years ago, my husband, Jonathan, passed away. He was a good man, though distant, often lost in the world of his work or his own thoughts. When he left, I resigned myself to a quiet life, gardening, attending family gatherings, and spending my evenings buried in books. That summer, everything changed when Nathan came to visit. He's Jonathan's nephew, 28 years old, and carried with him a kind of restless energy I couldn't quite place. Fresh from the city and seeking an escape, he decided to spend some time in the peaceful countryside. At first, he kept his distance, walking through the woods or lounging on the porch with a book in hand, but over time we began to talk, our conversations flowing effortlessly. There was something about the way he listened, the way he asked questions, that made me feel understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, while I was struggling with the old garden fence, Nathan appeared and offered to help. He worked quietly but with purpose, his focus unwavering. Watching him, I couldn't help but notice how different he was from Jonathan. Where Jonathan had always seemed a million miles away, Nathan was here, completely present. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself looking forward to his company. There was a lightness to him that I hadn't felt in so long, a reminder that life could still hold surprises. One warm afternoon, sunlight streaming through the trees, I decided to tackle the attic. It was one of those projects I'd put off forever, too many memories packed away in dusty boxes. I tied my hair back and began sorting through the clutter. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his shirt damp from the summer heat. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice tinged with a familiar playfulness. Before I could answer, he stepped in and picked up a heavy trunk with ease. "Careful with that," I said, unable to suppress a smile. "It's probably older than both of us combined." He grinned, setting it down gently. "Then I guess it's a good thing I'm here to help." As we worked side by side, we stumbled upon a box of old photographs. I couldn't help but laugh as I showed him moments from my younger days. He studied each picture intently, his green eyes filled with curiosity and something more. "You were beautiful," he said, holding up a photo of me in my 20s. I waved it off with a chuckle. "That was a long time ago." "It doesn't matter," he said softly, his gaze lingering on the photo before shifting back to me. There was something in the way he looked at me, something that made my heart pause. The air felt thicker, as if the attic itself held its breath. I quickly turned my attention back to the boxes, trying to steady myself. "These old things," I murmured, "are just pieces of a life that feels so far away now." Nathan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Maybe it doesn't have to feel so far away." I froze, his words hanging in the air like an unanswered question. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the space between us charged with something I couldn't yet name. "I didn't know how to carry it, Eleanor," Nathan said gently, his hand grazing mine as he reached for a photo. His voice was low but steady, a quiet reassurance in the stillness of the attic. "You don't have to do this alone. Life doesn't stop because someone you love is gone." I looked up at him, my heart thudding against my ribcage. There was so much I wanted to say, but the words stayed tangled in my chest. Instead, I nodded, letting his words seep into corners of myself I hadn't dared to examine. That evening, the house felt unusually quiet. Nathan had gone out for a walk, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat on the porch, a warm cup of tea cradled in my hands, watching the sun dip lazily below the horizon. My mind kept circling back to the attic, the way his words had stirred something dormant inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. When he returned, his cheeks were flushed from the cool evening air. He sat down across from me, the faint rustle of the chair breaking the silence. His gaze, thoughtful and questioning, met mine. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, though the weight in my chest told a different story. "Just thinking." "About what?" I hesitated, the words perched on the edge of my tongue. Then, deciding it was time for honesty, I spoke. "About what you said earlier. About not doing this alone. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His face softened, the quiet vulnerability in his expression disarming. "I didn't mean to push," he said, his voice almost a whisper. I've seen the weight you're carrying. And I know what that feels like." His words caught me off guard. "You do?" He nodded, his tone steady, though his eyes betrayed something deeper. "Losing people. It changes you. It makes you feel like the only way forward is to hold everything together by yourself. But you don't have to, Eleanor. You don't have to." His voice, filled with earnest conviction, made something inside me shift. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt a sliver of the heaviness lift, just enough to remind me what lightness might feel like. We stayed like that for a while, the silence between us a quiet balm rather than a burden. When Nathan finally stood to leave, he hesitated at the doorway. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft and warm. "Good night, Nathan," I replied, watching his figure disappear into the house. The next morning, I caught myself searching for reasons to be near him. Whether it was fixing odds and ends around the house or tending to the garden, his presence had become something I couldn't help but gravitate toward. One afternoon, as we knelt in the dirt planting flowers along the weathered fence, I broke the comfortable quiet. "Why did you leave the city?" Nathan paused, his hands brushing soil from his fingers. "I needed something different. I was chasing all the wrong things. Long hours, empty routines, always feeling like something was missing." "Is that why you came here?" I asked. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I was hoping to find clarity. Or, at the very least, some peace." I smiled, my voice light despite the heaviness of the moment. "You've come to the right place for that." Nathan looked up at me then, his green eyes locking onto mine. "Have I?" he asked quietly. The question lingered between us, weighted with unspoken meaning. I felt my hands tremble slightly, unsure how to respond. Instead, I turned back to the flowers, my focus shifting to the task in front of me. That evening, as I chopped vegetables for dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, a photo album I'd left out earlier open in front of him. His fingers moved gently over the pages, pausing now and then to study a picture. "Is this your wedding day?" he asked, holding up a photo of Alfred and me standing outside the church, the sunlight bouncing off our smiles. His voice was soft, almost reverent, as if he were peeling back a layer of my history. I nodded, setting down the knife. "It was a lifetime ago." "You look happy," he said, though there was a flicker of something in his tone. Curiosity, perhaps, or an unspoken sadness. "We were," I replied, my voice steady, though my focus stayed on the task at hand. "In our own way." The quiet that followed wasn't awkward, but contemplative, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Nathan held up a photo, one of Alfred and me standing in front of the church. "Is this your wedding day?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, setting the pot back on the stove. "It was a lifetime ago." "You look happy," he said, his tone steady, though there was a shadow of something else there. Curiosity, or perhaps even regret. "We were," I replied, focusing on the vegetables I was chopping. "In our own way." He closed the album, leaning back in his chair as his gaze settled on me. "And now?" I paused, the rhythm of the knife faltering. Turning to face him, I gave a small smile. "Now I'm just trying to figure out what comes next." Nathan's expression softened, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it carried a weight that neither of us felt the need to fill. Over the following days, our conversations grew richer. Nathan shared stories of his childhood, his dreams, fears, and the feelings of disconnection that led him to the countryside. In turn, I opened up about pieces of my life I had long kept buried, moments I hadn't revisited in years. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching fireflies flicker in the darkness, Nathan turned to me. His voice broke the stillness. Do you ever think about starting over? He asked. Starting over? I repeated, uncertain of what he meant. Yeah, he said, his voice thoughtful, letting go of the past, finding something new, someone new. His words caught me off guard, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. I don't know, I admitted. I guess I always thought it was too late for something like that. Nathan shook his head gently, a small smile tugging at his lips. It's never too late. His words stayed with me, lingering in the quiet moments of my day. Then came the rainy afternoon that changed everything. A sudden storm had rolled in, and we found ourselves confined to the house. I was in the living room, sorting through a box of old books. Need a hand? Nathan's warm voice startled me from my thoughts. I smiled, gesturing toward the donate pile. Sure, these can go over there. As he knelt beside me, our hands brushed lightly. The touch was fleeting but electric, a sudden reminder of how alive I still was. Eleanor, he murmured, his voice steady yet hesitant. I looked up, meeting his gaze. His green eyes searched mine with an intensity that
left me breathless. Before I could respond, he reached out, taking my hand in his. You're not alone, he said softly. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself anymore. His words broke through something deep inside me, and for the first time in years, I felt my carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. The days that followed were a mix of clarity and uncertainty. Nathan and I had crossed an invisible line, one that neither of us fully understood, but both of us felt deeply. His presence brought a new energy into my life, a spark I hadn't realized I'd been missing. One crisp autumn morning, with golden leaves swirling in the breeze, we went for a walk through the woods. The silence between us was warm and comfortable, words unnecessary. We stopped in a clearing, sunlight filtering through the trees. Nathan turned to me, his expression hesitant. I've been thinking, he said, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. I tilted my head, encouraging him to continue. I don't know where this is going, he admitted, motioning between us. But I do know that I don't want to walk this path without you. His honesty caught me off guard, and my breath hitched. Nathan, I began, my voice trembling. I don't have all the answers. I don't even know if I'm ready to look for them. He smiled gently, his gaze steady. Then we'll figure it out together. His words, so simple yet so profound, brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I had carried the weight of my past alone, convinced it was my burden to bear. And now, here was Nathan, offering to share it with no conditions, no expectations. As we stood in that clearing, surrounded by the rustling trees, I realized something important. Life doesn't always offer us tidy resolutions or perfect endings, but it does give us chances to begin again. I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. Together, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, we sat on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the air crisp with the promise of change. Nathan glanced at me, a softness in his green eyes. You know, he said with a faint smile, I think this is the start of something good. I nodded, my heart lighter than it had been in years. I think so too. In that moment, I let myself believe it. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. The future, for the first time in forever, felt like a story I was ready to write, with Nathan by my side.